Feeling abandoned? My son kicked me out. When he found out I lost my job, but I had a secret fortune. Waiting. Feeling abandoned is one of the most painful experiences anyone can go through. In today's video, we share a powerful story of a mother's sacrifice, betrayal, and the emotional toll of feeling abandoned. If you've ever felt left behind by those you love, this video will resonate with you. Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Stories TH for more stories of strength and healing. The story of Margaret, a mother who dedicated her entire life to raising her son Aaron, is a powerful reflection of the sacrifices and pain many parents experience in their relationship with their children. For over 30 years, Margaret worked tirelessly, sacrificing her own happiness and well-being to ensure Aaron had the best life possible. She raised him on her own, put him through school, and even made the ultimate sacrifice by putting her marriage behind her in order to focus on him. As time passed, Margaret worked long hours and often juggled multiple jobs to support their household. Her hard work seemed to be a never-ending cycle, but it was all done with one goal in mind, giving her son the best chance at life. However, despite all her efforts, when Margaret lost her job, she was met with a cold, heartless response from Aaron. Instead of understanding or support, Aaron dismissed her, calling her a useless burden and pushing her out of his life. This devastating moment marked a turning point for Margaret. For the first time in her life, she stopped swallowing her pride and refused to be mistreated any longer. The emotional turmoil Margaret faced in that moment is something many parents can relate to. It's the feeling of being unseen, unappreciated, and, ultimately, betrayed by the very person they had sacrificed everything for. Margaret had given up so much for Aaron, her career, her marriage, her own sense of self, believing that one day he would appreciate the immense love and effort she poured into his upbringing. Yet, instead of gratitude, she was met with disdain. This betrayal was not only personal, but also deeply hurtful, as she realized that Aaron and his wife, Nicole, saw her only as a source of money, a walking ATM, rather than a mother deserving of respect and care. They wanted her to keep working, contributing financially, even at the cost of her own health and happiness. This realization was a hard pill to swallow, but it also marked the beginning of Margaret's journey toward reclaiming her dignity and independence. Margaret's decision to walk away was an act of defiance, empowerment, and self-preservation. For the first time, she realized that her life had been defined by the needs and expectations of others, and that it was time for her to live for herself. It wasn't easy, especially when she had been raised to believe that a mother's role was to serve and sacrifice endlessly. But Margaret's courage to stand up for herself was a lesson in self-worth, showing that it's never too late to prioritize your own happiness and well-being. With the inheritance left to her by her late employer, an inheritance that Aaron didn't know about, Margaret found the financial freedom to truly start anew. She reclaimed what was rightfully hers, including the home she had worked so hard to provide for her son and his family, but which they had so heartlessly taken for granted. The emotional roller coaster Margaret went through is something many older adults can relate to, especially those who have spent their entire lives giving to others. As people age, there's often an expectation that their role in the family is to continue giving, whether emotionally or financially. This story highlights the dangers of self-sacrifice taken too far, where one's identity becomes so intertwined with their role as a provider and caregiver that they lose sight of their own needs and desires. Margaret's decision to cut ties with her son, to stop allowing him to take advantage of her, was a powerful moment of self-realization. It was a moment of liberation, where she finally understood that she was worthy of respect, love, and kindness, not just from others, but also from herself. In a world that often expects older adults to simply fade into the background, Margaret's story is a reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your life, to set boundaries, and to live on your own terms. This is particularly important for seniors who have spent years caring for others, often at the expense of their own dreams and aspirations. For Margaret, the inheritance she received wasn't just about the money, it was about the freedom to live for herself, to make choices that weren't dictated by the expectations of others. With this newfound freedom, Margaret was able to walk away from the toxic environment her son had created and build a life that was truly her own. Her decision to move into a luxury home, to reclaim what was hers, and to live her life with dignity and independence is an inspiring message for anyone who has been taken for granted, especially seniors who may feel invisible or unappreciated in their later years. The story also serves as a reminder that relationships with our loved ones can change, and sometimes letting go is the only way to find peace. In the end, Margaret's life became a testament to the importance of self-care, setting boundaries, and embracing the opportunity for a new chapter, free from the burdens of the past. This story is not just about the betrayal of a mother by her son, but also about the power of reclaiming one's sense of self and independence, especially in later years. Margaret's journey is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to take control of your life, to stand up for yourself, and to choose happiness and fulfillment over endless sacrifice. For those in their later years, it's a call to action, to stop being defined by the needs of others and to start living a life that brings joy, purpose, and peace. Margaret's story is a poignant and deeply emotional tale of self-realization, betrayal, and empowerment. She dedicated her life to raising her son, Aaron, and sacrificed everything to ensure he had the best possible future. From working multiple jobs to paying for his education, Margaret poured every ounce of energy and love into raising him. She even put her own marriage on the back burner, all in the hope that one day Aaron would appreciate the immense sacrifices she made for him. But when Margaret found herself unemployed, it was her son who turned on her, calling her a useless burden and pushing her out of the house she had worked so hard to provide for him. This cruel betrayal was the final straw that broke Margaret's heart and forced her to face a painful truth. Despite everything she had given him, Aaron had only ever seen her as a source of money, a walking ATM, instead of as the loving, selfless mother she truly was. In that moment, Margaret stopped swallowing her pride and made a life-changing decision. She realized that her worth was not tied to the sacrifices she made for others, especially when those sacrifices were met with disrespect and cruelty. Margaret had been giving to Aaron for over 3 decades, but when it was time for him to give back, he showed no appreciation or gratitude. This awakening, though painful, was also liberating. Margaret recognized that she deserved better, that she was not meant to live her life as a servant to her son and his family. Her self-worth could no longer be measured by how much she could give to others, especially when it was met with nothing but disdain. It was time to live for herself, to reclaim the life she had long put on hold. The emotional weight of Margaret's journey is something many can relate to, particularly those who have spent their entire lives giving to others. Parents, especially, often give up their own dreams, desires, and well-being in order to raise their children, believing that one day they will receive the love and appreciation they deserve in return. But when that return doesn't come, it can feel like a deep betrayal. Margaret's realization that her son viewed her as little more than a financial resource was gut-wrenching, but it was also a powerful moment of clarity. No longer would she allow herself to be taken for granted. This story speaks to the heart of what it means to be a caregiver and how sometimes that role can be used to manipulate and control others. The decision Margaret made to walk away from her son and his family was a bold and empowering choice. After years of giving everything to others, she finally understood that her own happiness and well-being mattered. She no longer needed to sacrifice herself for people who saw her as a means to an end. Her decision to quit her job and refuse to be used any longer was not just about leaving Aaron behind. It was about reclaiming her dignity and her future. She had worked hard all her life, and now it was time to live for herself. Margaret's journey is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to put yourself first and take control of your own destiny. What followed was a profound transformation. Armed with a large inheritance left to her by a respected former employer, Margaret had the financial freedom to break free from the toxic environment that had defined her life for so long. This inheritance, which Aaron didn't know about, was not just about the money, it was about the power it gave her to finally live on her own terms. Margaret didn't need her son's approval or validation any longer. She had worked for everything she had, and now she was ready to live a life that was truly her own. But the journey didn't end there. Margaret's path towards self-discovery took her into a world of luxury and independence, far removed from the life she had known. With her newfound financial security, she was able to buy a luxurious home, move into a comfortable and peaceful environment, and begin living life on her own terms. Margaret's story is one of empowerment, showing that it's never too late to redefine your life, to set boundaries, and to choose happiness over sacrifice. Margaret's decision to confront her son publicly, to expose the truth about his manipulative behavior, and to take legal action against him was a final act of defiance. She had nothing left to lose, but in the process, she reclaimed her sense of self-worth and her freedom. The legal victory was just the beginning of a new chapter for Margaret. She no longer had to live under the shadow of her son's expectations. The toxic relationship that had drained her for so long was over, and Margaret was free to pursue the life she had always dreamed of. For seniors, particularly those who have spent their lives raising children or caring for others, Margaret's story is a powerful lesson in self-care, boundaries, and independence. It's easy to get caught up in the role of caregiver, provider, and sacrificer, but this story reminds us that it's just as important to care for ourselves. For many, the idea of setting boundaries or walking away from toxic relationships can be frightening, but Margaret's journey shows that doing so can lead to a more fulfilling and peaceful life. It's never too late to take control, to stand up for yourself, and to live a life that brings joy and purpose. In the end, Margaret's story is about rediscovering herself, learning to live for her own happiness, and embracing the freedom that comes with taking control of her own life. The emotional depth of her journey resonates with many older adults who may have spent years putting the needs of others before their own. It's a reminder that self-worth is not defined by how much you can give, but by how much you value yourself. Margaret found peace when she stopped sacrificing herself for others and started living for herself. It's a message that can inspire anyone at any age to take control of their future and create a life that is truly their own. Margaret's story is a deeply emotional journey of self-discovery, personal empowerment, and the painful realization that sometimes, no matter how much we give, we are not appreciated in the way we deserve. For decades, Margaret dedicated herself to raising her son, Aaron. She sacrificed her career, her marriage, and countless moments of her own happiness to ensure that Aaron would have a better life. She worked tirelessly to provide for him, sometimes holding down multiple jobs, and made every sacrifice imaginable, all in the hope that one day Aaron would recognize the love and dedication she poured into his upbringing. Yet, when Margaret found herself in a difficult situation and lost her job, it was her son who turned on her, calling her a useless burden and demanding that she leave the house she had worked so hard to provide for him. This heartbreaking betrayal was the moment Margaret realized the painful truth. All of her sacrifices, all of her years of hard work had been taken for granted, and Aaron saw her not as a loving mother, but as a mere financial resource. This moment of realization, though devastating, was also a turning point for Margaret. She could no longer keep swallowing her pride and pretending that everything was okay. For the first time in decades, Margaret stood up for herself. She knew that she had spent her entire life giving to others, but now it was time to put herself first. No longer willing to be a doormat in her own life, Margaret made a choice that would change everything. She walked away from her son and his family. This decision wasn't just about leaving a toxic situation, it was about reclaiming her dignity and self-respect. Margaret realized that she no longer needed to be defined by the sacrifices she had made for others. Her worth was not determined by how much she could give, but by her inherent value as a person. She understood that sometimes, in order to protect oneself, one must walk away from those who have shown no appreciation, no gratitude, and no respect. For Margaret, the emotional weight of this decision was profound, but it was also a liberating moment of clarity. She had given her son everything: her time, her money, her love, and her life. But when it came time for him to show any form of gratitude or support, Aaron turned his back on her. This harsh reality forced Margaret to recognize the truth. Her son saw her as nothing more than a means to an end, a person to provide for him and his family without any expectation of being treated with kindness or respect in return. This painful realization left Margaret heartbroken, but it also sparked a fire within her. She knew she deserved better than to be treated like a financial lifeline. She deserved a life where her needs, her desires, and her happiness were just as important as those of others. Margaret's decision to walk away was not just about rejecting Aaron's mistreatment. It was about reclaiming her own future. She had always sacrificed her own dreams, her own desires, and her own well-being to ensure that Aaron had the best possible life. But in doing so, she had neglected herself. She had spent years putting everyone else first, never allowing herself the opportunity to rest, to relax, or to enjoy life on her own terms. Now, with the inheritance she received from a former employer, Margaret had the financial means to create the life she had always dreamed of. The money wasn't just a symbol of wealth, it was a symbol of freedom, of independence, and of the possibility to live her life for herself, not for anyone else. The inheritance Margaret received was a game changer. It wasn't just the financial windfall that mattered, it was the fact that Margaret had the freedom to choose her own path. No longer did she need to worry about supporting a son who treated her like a walking ATM. No longer did she have to work herself into the ground just to maintain a toxic relationship. The money gave her the opportunity to stop living for others and start living for herself. She used her newfound wealth to buy a beautiful home, one that was hers alone, and she began to explore a life that was no longer tied to the expectations of others. But even as Margaret began to embrace her independence, she still faced the consequences of Aaron's betrayal. The pain of being rejected by her son didn't vanish overnight, and the anger and resentment she felt towards him lingered for some time. However, as Margaret's journey unfolded, she realized that the true value of her life was not in her son's approval or the recognition of others. It was in her own self-worth and the ability to live authentically. She had spent too many years trying to meet the expectations of others, and now she was finally free to pursue her own happiness. This was a profound lesson in self-care and personal boundaries, one that would resonate deeply with anyone who has given selflessly for years, only to find themselves taken for granted. As Margaret's journey continued, she made the decision to confront her son publicly, exposing his manipulative and selfish behavior for all to see. She took legal action to reclaim the house that had once been hers, and she stood firm in her resolve to never allow herself to be treated with disrespect again. This was not just an act of defiance, it was an act of self-preservation. Margaret's actions were a powerful reminder that it's never too late to take control of your life, and that you don't have to stay in toxic relationships, no matter how deep the emotional ties may be. She proved that it's possible to break free from the past and build a future that is truly your own. In the end, Margaret's story is about empowerment, self-respect, and the courage to walk away from a situation that no longer serves you. It's a story about reclaiming your life, your dignity, and your happiness. For anyone who has ever felt taken for granted or unappreciated, Margaret's journey is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to put yourself first and live the life you truly deserve. Margaret's journey is one of profound transformation, self-discovery, and the painful realization that sometimes, even after all the sacrifices we make for the ones we love, we are not appreciated the way we deserve. For nearly 3 decades, Margaret gave her all to raise her son, Aaron. She sacrificed her own dreams, her career, her personal happiness, and her time to ensure that he would have a better life. Every job she worked, every sacrifice she made, was for him. Yet, when the day came that Margaret lost her job, instead of offering comfort or support, Aaron turned on her. He called her a useless burden, showing no empathy for the years of devotion she had given him. This was the breaking point for Margaret. She realized that the unconditional love she had so freely given was not reciprocated in the way she had imagined. In that moment, the weight of years of sacrifice hit her with brutal clarity, and she knew she could no longer be the mother who let herself be stepped on. For the first time, Margaret stood up for herself. She had always been the caretaker, the one who gave without question, and now, after everything she had done for her son, she realized it was time to put herself first. The emotional turmoil of this decision was immense, but it was also liberating. No longer would she be defined by the sacrifices she had made for others. No longer would she allow herself to be a walking ATM, a source of endless support without being treated with the respect she deserved. Margaret's decision to walk away from Aaron and his family was not just about rejecting their mistreatment, it was about reclaiming her life. She realized that, after all the years of giving, she deserved to live for herself, not for anyone else. She needed to find her own happiness, her own peace, and no longer live under the weight of expectations that had never truly been her own. This pivotal moment in Margaret's life was not only about setting boundaries, but about choosing to live authentically. She had spent so many years working herself into the ground, trying to be everything to everyone, and now she had the chance to live a life that was hers, and hers alone. But the emotional pain of Aaron's betrayal lingered. The son she had raised, the child she had sacrificed everything for, had turned on her without a second thought. His cruelty stung, but it also pushed Margaret to the realization that her worth was not tied to the role of a self-sacrificing mother. She had spent so many years defining herself through her relationship with Aaron, but now she understood that she was not just a mother or a provider. She was a woman with her own desires, dreams, and needs. This was her chance to live for herself, not for anyone else. With her newfound financial security from the inheritance left to her by a former employer, Margaret felt a sense of freedom she had never known. The money wasn't just a windfall, it was the key to unlocking a new chapter in her life. The financial stability allowed Margaret to take control of her future, to create a life that was not dictated by others' expectations. She used this opportunity to buy a home for herself, one that was hers and hers alone, and to begin building the life she had always dreamed of. Margaret no longer had to work tirelessly to please others. She no longer had to bend over backwards to support a son who had shown her nothing but disrespect. She could finally focus on her own well-being and pursue the happiness she had put on hold for so long. However, as she began to embrace her independence, the fallout from her decision continued. Aaron, unable to accept that his mother had chosen to stop being his financial support, attempted to guilt and manipulate her into coming back. He resorted to using emotional manipulation, trying to make Margaret feel like a heartless, selfish mother for walking away. But Margaret was resolute. She knew that her decision to cut ties with him was not an act of cruelty, it was an act of survival. She had spent her entire life taking care of others, and now it was time for her to take care of herself. The emotional roller coaster of this decision was not easy, but it was necessary. Margaret's decision to reclaim her life was a hard one, but it was the only choice that could set her free. She had given so much for so long that it had become impossible to ignore the toll it had taken on her. Now, it was time for Margaret to stand up for herself and take back the life that had been slowly slipping away from her for decades. In the end, Margaret's story is about empowerment, self-respect, and the importance of putting yourself first. It's a reminder that no matter how much we give to others, we are not obligated to lose ourselves in the process. Margaret's journey is about learning that true love for others starts with love for oneself. It's about recognizing that kindness and generosity should not come at the cost of our own well-being. Through her story, Margaret teaches us that it's never too late to reclaim your life, to set boundaries, and to start living for yourself. It may take time, and the path may be filled with challenges, but the reward is worth the struggle. Margaret's journey is a testament to the power of self-respect and the courage to walk away from what no longer serves you, no matter how painful it may be. Margaret's journey is a powerful narrative about reclaiming one's life after years of selfless sacrifice. For over 3 decades, she devoted herself to raising her son, Ethan. She worked tirelessly, often taking on multiple jobs, just to ensure that he had everything he needed to succeed in life. Margaret sacrificed her own happiness, her career, and even her marriage to give Ethan the life she thought he deserved. But despite all of this, the moment she needed support, Ethan turned against her. When she lost her job, instead of offering sympathy or comfort, he berated her, calling her a useless burden and telling her she had no value. In that painful moment, Margaret realized that the love and sacrifices she had poured into her son were not reciprocated. This was the tipping point that led Margaret to make a decision that would change the course of her life. She would no longer let herself be treated like a doormat. She would stand up for herself, no longer allowing herself to be defined by her role as a mother or a provider, but instead, finally living for herself. Margaret's decision to walk away from Ethan and his wife, Nicole, was not an easy one. It came with a heavy emotional toll, as she had spent so many years identifying herself through her role in their lives. But as painful as it was, it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The emotional pain of betrayal weighed heavily on her, but it also ignited a fire within her to reclaim her independence and her sense of self-worth. She had spent years giving everything to others: her time, her love, her energy. But now, for the first time, she decided to put herself first. Margaret realized that she didn't owe anyone anything. She had given her all, and it was time to focus on her own happiness. The emotional relief she felt from this decision was profound, and it became the first step in her journey to healing and empowerment. The inheritance she received from her late employer gave Margaret the financial freedom she had long been denied. Catherine, the woman who had treated her like family, had left Margaret a substantial fortune, $8 million. This was a turning point. It wasn't just about the money, it was about finally having the means to live a life where she wasn't constantly being used as a financial support system. Margaret had worked hard her entire life, and now she was finally able to live on her terms. The inheritance was her key to freedom, a freedom she had longed for but had never been able to fully grasp. It allowed her to purchase a new home for herself, to step out of the shadow of her past, and to start fresh. Margaret no longer had to work tirelessly to please others. She could finally focus on herself and her own needs. However, the emotional impact of Ethan's betrayal lingered. His reaction to her leaving him and Nicole behind was one of anger, shame, and manipulation. He tried to guilt her into coming back, playing the victim, and painting himself as the abandoned son. But Margaret saw through his facade. She realized that his cries weren't for love, they were cries for money. He wasn't concerned about her well-being or their relationship. He was upset because he no longer had access to the financial support she had provided. Ethan's manipulation was rooted in a deep sense of entitlement, and Margaret finally recognized that he had never truly appreciated her. She had spent years sacrificing for him, but he had never once acknowledged her efforts in a meaningful way. Instead, he had only seen her as a tool to fund his lifestyle. In the face of this emotional upheaval, Margaret's resolve strengthened. She knew she had made the right decision, but the path forward was still fraught with challenges. Ethan's attempts to manipulate her and to guilt her into returning were relentless. He used every tactic at his disposal, from playing the victim to staging dramatic public scenes, hoping to wear her down. But Margaret remained firm. She knew that she couldn't go back to a life where she was constantly being used and manipulated. Her decision to walk away from Ethan was not just about ending a toxic relationship, it was about taking back her life, her happiness, and her self-respect. Margaret's story is a powerful lesson in self-care and self-preservation. It teaches us that, no matter how much we love someone, we must never lose sight of our own needs. Love and sacrifice should never come at the cost of our own well-being. Margaret's journey shows us that sometimes the hardest but most important decision we can make is to walk away from relationships that drain us. Her story is a reminder that we have the power to redefine our lives, to set boundaries, and to reclaim our happiness. It's never too late to choose ourselves, to live for ourselves, and to create the life we deserve. The pain of betrayal is real, but it can also be a catalyst for transformation. Margaret's courage to stand up for herself and to put an end to the cycle of sacrifice is a testament to the power of self-respect and the importance of living authentically. Through her journey, Margaret found not only financial freedom, but emotional liberation, proving that it's never too late to take control of your own life. Margaret's story is one of deep emotional transformation and self-realization. For over 3 decades, she had given everything for her son, Ethan, her time, her energy, and even her own personal happiness. She worked tirelessly, taking on multiple jobs, just to ensure that he had the best opportunities in life. She even sacrificed her marriage to make sure Ethan had the support and love he needed. Margaret had dedicated her life to him without hesitation, but when the time came for her to rely on him, she was met with harsh rejection. When Margaret lost her job, instead of offering empathy, Ethan's first response was to treat her like a burden. He dismissed her struggles with cruel words, calling her useless and telling her she was nothing more than a parasite. That moment marked the turning point in Margaret's life. For the first time, she saw Ethan not as the son she had loved and sacrificed for, but as someone who viewed her only as a tool to support his lifestyle. The pain of betrayal was overwhelming, but it also ignited a fire in her to finally stand up for herself. Margaret realized that she could no longer let herself be manipulated or taken for granted. even by the child she had raised. The betrayal was a catalyst for Margaret's emotional liberation. No longer willing to live her life as a servant to others' demands, Margaret made a bold decision. She would retire and stop living in the shadow of her son's expectations. This decision, while difficult, marked the beginning of her reclaiming her independence. She had given so much of herself for years working overtime, taking on additional jobs, and even spending her savings to buy Ethan and his wife Nicole a house. But despite her sacrifices, Ethan had never truly appreciated her efforts. His behavior revealed a deep sense of entitlement and a complete lack of gratitude. He didn't see her as a mother. He saw her only as a source of financial support. Margaret's realization was painful, but it was necessary. She finally understood that she had spent years sacrificing her happiness for a son who was more interested in her money than in her love. And with this realization came the clarity she needed to walk away from the toxic relationship she had with him. As Margaret's emotional transformation unfolded, another key factor was her inheritance from her late employer, Catherine, who had treated her like family. Catherine's will left Margaret a substantial fortune, $8 million, something Margaret had never expected, but which offered her the financial freedom to break away from the cycle of self-sacrifice. For the first time in her life, Margaret didn't have to worry about money or about being forced to work just to survive. She had worked long hours for years, making sacrifices, and now Catherine's gift was her ticket to freedom. With the money, Margaret could now live the life she had always dreamed of, but had never had the chance to pursue. The inheritance was a symbol of Margaret's hard work and resilience, and it gave her the opportunity to redefine her life on her terms. No longer bound by financial worry, Margaret was free to focus on her own well-being and happiness. Despite her newfound wealth, Margaret's emotional healing wasn't immediate. The pain of Ethan's betrayal lingered, and his attempts to manipulate her continued. He tried to guilt her into coming back, painting himself as the victim of her harsh decision. But Margaret saw through his lies. She recognized that Ethan's true concern wasn't for her, it was for the loss of his financial safety net. His manipulations were rooted in greed, not love. Margaret's decision to leave him behind was the first step in reclaiming her self-worth and dignity. She had spent so many years sacrificing herself for Ethan, but now she was finally choosing herself. This was a painful, yet necessary act of self-care. Ethan's reactions only confirmed Margaret's decision. He escalated his tactics, going so far as to use social media to publicly slander her. He portrayed himself as the abandoned son, painting Margaret as the heartless villain who had cut him off without care. This emotional manipulation was a direct attempt to guilt her into coming back, but Margaret wasn't fooled. She decided to take control of the narrative. She launched her own social media campaign, sharing the truth of her sacrifices and the reality of her relationship with Ethan. She revealed the extent of his manipulation, showing that his cries weren't for love, they were for money. Margaret was no longer willing to let Ethan control her story, and she made sure the public saw him for who he truly was. In a dramatic turn, Margaret took legal action against Ethan, filing a defamation lawsuit for the harm he caused her with his lies. The legal proceedings, while challenging, empowered Margaret to take back control of her life. She had spent too long being manipulated and used, but now she was standing up for herself in a way she had never done before. Margaret's decision to fight back wasn't just about protecting her wealth, it was about protecting her dignity. She was no longer the mother who would sacrifice herself endlessly for the sake of others. She was a woman who had learned to protect her own well-being, no matter the cost. Margaret's emotional transformation culminated in her reclaiming her life not just financially, but also emotionally and spiritually. She moved into a new home, leaving behind the years of resentment and bitterness that had defined her past. In her new life, Margaret finally found the peace and fulfillment she had been searching for all these years. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances or her son's manipulation. She was a woman who had learned to stand up for herself and to live life on her own terms. The emotional weight that had burdened her for so long was lifted, and in its place, Margaret found the freedom to finally live for herself. Her story is a testament to the power of self-care, the importance of setting boundaries, and the strength it takes to reclaim your life when you've been taken for granted. Margaret's story is one of resilience, transformation, and ultimately, empowerment. For 30 years, she dedicated herself to raising her son, Ethan. She sacrificed her own happiness, her marriage, and her career, all to ensure he had the best life possible. Margaret worked tirelessly to provide for him, even when it meant working multiple jobs or pouring all her resources into paying for his education and buying him a house. Yet, despite all of this, the moment Margaret lost her job, Ethan's first reaction was to call her a burden, a parasite, and dismiss her as a useless drain on his life. This moment of betrayal was the catalyst for Margaret's emotional shift, and for the first time, she made the bold decision to stand up for herself. Margaret had spent years selflessly giving to Ethan, but now she was finally ready to prioritize her own well-being. This moment marked the beginning of her emotional liberation, even though it came with immense pain. The realization that Ethan viewed her not as a loving mother, but as a resource to be exploited, was heartbreaking. For years, she had poured everything into him, sacrificing her own life to ensure his success. Yet, when the tables were turned and she needed support, he turned his back on her without hesitation. This was the moment when Margaret understood that she had been living her life for others, but in return, she had received nothing but disdain and disrespect. The pain of this realization was overwhelming, but it was also what sparked her decision to reclaim her independence. Margaret had been so wrapped up in fulfilling the roles of mother and caregiver that she had forgotten to care for herself. She had spent decades living for her son and for the expectations of others, but now she was going to live for herself. A pivotal moment in Margaret's transformation came when she learned of the $8 million inheritance left to her by her late employer, Catherine. Margaret had worked for Catherine for many years, and their relationship had been one of mutual respect and admiration. Catherine, who had no children of her own, had left her entire fortune to Margaret. This inheritance, while it could have been a bittersweet reminder of the sacrifices Margaret had made throughout her life, was also the key to her new beginning. For the first time, Margaret had the financial freedom to break away from the toxic environment Ethan and his wife Nicole had created. She no longer had to depend on anyone for survival, and she could now live her life on her own terms. Catherine's gift gave Margaret the ability to stand up to Ethan and his wife, who had only seen her as a means to an end. It was the moment Margaret realized that she could break free from the chains of self-sacrifice and choose herself. However, the emotional journey Margaret underwent wasn't without struggle. Despite the inheritance, the pain of being rejected by her son lingered. Ethan's behavior, which ranged from manipulation to outright cruelty, made it clear that he didn't see her as a mother, but as a financial tool. Margaret's decision to quit her job and retire was seen by Ethan as an act of betrayal. He wanted her to keep working, to keep providing for his family, even though she had already sacrificed so much for him. When Margaret expressed her desire to retire, her son's reaction was one of anger and disdain. He didn't understand her need for rest. Instead, he saw her decision as a threat to his lifestyle. His wife, Nicole, and her mother, Susan, quickly joined forces, dismissing Margaret's contributions and belittling her desire to take time for herself. They treated her as though she were nothing more than a servant, someone who was only valuable as long as she continued to provide. But this treatment only strengthened Margaret's resolve. The more they pushed her, the more determined she became to stand up for herself. Margaret's emotional transformation culminated in a powerful moment of clarity and liberation. She realized that her self-worth wasn't tied to her ability to work or provide for others. She had spent years sacrificing her happiness for her son and his family, but now she was ready to take control of her own life. The inheritance gave her the financial freedom to make this choice, but it was her inner strength that allowed her to follow through. Margaret knew she had to sever ties with Ethan, despite the pain it caused her. She could no longer allow herself to be manipulated or controlled by someone who saw her only as a source of money. Margaret's decision wasn't about the money, it was about reclaiming her dignity and self-respect. As Margaret stepped into her new life, she began to see the world differently. She sold the villas she had purchased during her emotional turmoil and used the proceeds to invest in her future. Margaret's new home, located in a quiet lakeside town, symbolized her new beginning. The house was a place of peace and self-care, where Margaret could finally rest and enjoy the fruits of her labor. She no longer had to worry about pleasing anyone else. She could simply live for herself. This quiet, serene existence was the life Margaret had always dreamed of, but had never allowed herself to have. Her emotional journey was a testament to the power of self-care and the importance of setting boundaries with those who take advantage of your love and generosity. Margaret's story is one of personal growth and the power of standing up for yourself, even when it feels like the world is against you. Through years of self-sacrifice and emotional pain, Margaret learned that kindness should never come at the expense of your own well-being. She found the courage to let go of a toxic relationship with her son and began living a life of freedom and peace. Her journey serves as a powerful reminder that it's never too late to choose yourself, and that true happiness comes from within, not from the approval of others. Margaret's story is one of deep transformation, heartbreak, and eventual liberation. She spent over 30 years dedicating herself to raising her adopted son, Ethan, pouring every ounce of her love and energy into giving him the best possible life. From the moment she adopted him, when he was a frail baby abandoned by his birth parents, Margaret made sacrifices that many wouldn't understand. She worked multiple jobs, sometimes 3 at a time, to provide for him, ensuring he had a stable home, a good education, and every opportunity she could afford. She gave up her own career dreams, her personal life, and even her marriage to raise him. Margaret's ex-husband had walked away from the family years ago, and the emotional and financial burden fell entirely on her shoulders. Yet, despite everything she sacrificed, Ethan's attitude toward her had been one of entitlement and disrespect. The day Margaret told Ethan she had lost her job, his response shattered her. He called her a useless burden, a parasite, and essentially dismissed her as nothing more than a financial tool to support his lifestyle. That moment of betrayal became the turning point in Margaret's life. For the first time, Margaret refused to be the victim anymore. She had given everything she had to raise him, often at the cost of her own happiness and health. But this time, when Ethan cast her aside, Margaret made a bold decision. She was no longer going to sacrifice herself for the sake of someone who didn't appreciate her. The realization that Ethan had only seen her as a resource, the woman who worked herself to the bone to provide for him, without ever receiving gratitude, was a painful blow, but it was also liberating. Margaret understood now that she had to reclaim her life, her dignity, and her future. She wasn't going to be the mother who continued to be stepped on, overlooked, and ignored. It was time for her to live for herself. What Margaret didn't initially know was that her late employer, Catherine, had left her a fortune $8 million. Catherine had been like family to Margaret, treating her with respect and kindness that Margaret had rarely received in her own life. She had no children of her own, so she made Margaret the sole beneficiary of her estate. This inheritance became the key to Margaret's freedom. Finally, Margaret didn't have to rely on anyone else to survive. She could live her life on her terms. This newfound financial security gave her the power to take control of her life in a way she never had before. Yet, even with the money, Margaret wasn't driven by revenge or anger, though there was plenty of room for that. What truly drove her was the deep desire to reclaim her self-worth and peace. Margaret's decision to retire and take time for herself wasn't received well by her son and his wife, Nicole. Instead of supporting her need for rest, they saw it as a betrayal, a loss of the financial support they had grown accustomed to. Their harsh treatment of her, particularly Nicole's cruel dismissal of Margaret's offer to help with their upcoming baby, made Margaret realize just how far they had pushed her. Their dismissal of her efforts over the years, her sacrifices, her love, and the selflessness she had shown was all part of a pattern of manipulation and emotional abuse. It wasn't just about money. It was about their treatment of her as if she were nothing more than a servant. They wanted her to keep working, to keep giving, without ever showing appreciation or love in return. Nicole even suggested Margaret go back to work as a live-in assistant for a wealthy man, something that, in their minds, was her only value. At this point, Margaret's emotional journey took another turn. The inheritance, which she initially kept secret, became her weapon of empowerment. She didn't tell Ethan or Nicole about the money at first. She didn't want their attitude to change simply because of her financial windfall. Instead, Margaret decided to stop trying to please them. When she made it clear she was no longer going to be their personal ATM, that's when the true scope of their selfishness became apparent. Ethan's anger and entitlement continued, and his cruel remarks about her past choices stung. He went so far as to accuse her of ruining his life, not understanding that every decision Margaret had made was with his best interest at heart. This moment of realization was profound for Margaret. She had spent so many years sacrificing her own well-being for Ethan's future. But now she was finally seeing that Ethan wasn't interested in appreciating her sacrifices. He just wanted to continue exploiting her. The emotional toll this all took on Margaret was immense, yet as her confidence grew, so did her sense of freedom. She didn't need their approval anymore. She was ready to sever the toxic ties that had bound her to Ethan and Nicole for years. The true turning point came when Margaret made the decision to sell her properties and start fresh. She reclaimed her life, her financial freedom, and her peace. She moved to a quiet, serene lakeside town where for the first time in years she could breathe freely. Her new life was a symbol of everything she had fought for. It wasn't just about the money, it was about Margaret, finally putting herself first after decades of self-sacrifice. Through this emotional journey, Margaret learned an invaluable lesson. Self-care is not selfish, and setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. She had been the quintessential mother, giving everything she had for the well-being of her family. But in doing so, she had lost herself. Now, she was reclaiming that lost self, empowered by her ability to stand up for her own needs. This story serves as a powerful reminder to everyone, especially those who have spent their lives giving to others, that it's never too late to choose yourself. Margaret's decision to stop enabling her son's toxic behavior and start living for herself is a lesson in self-respect and strength. It's a story of reclaiming your life, no matter how much you've given up in the past. Margaret's future was now her own to shape, free from the weight of guilt, expectations, and manipulation. Margaret's journey is a compelling testament to personal transformation, resilience, and the realization that self-worth should never be sacrificed for the sake of others. For over 30 years, she dedicated her life to raising Ethan, the son she adopted when he was a vulnerable baby, abandoned by his birth parents. From the very beginning, Margaret knew that life would be difficult for both her and Ethan, but she poured every ounce of energy she had into providing him with a better future. She worked tirelessly, sometimes juggling multiple jobs, while also sacrificing her own personal dreams and aspirations to ensure Ethan had everything he needed. Margaret's relationship with her ex-husband had already ended, and she bore the entire weight of raising Ethan alone. Yet, despite her sacrifices, Margaret found herself betrayed and cast aside by the very person she had devoted her life to, Ethan. When Margaret lost her job, she thought it would be a moment of support and understanding from her son, but instead Ethan reacted with anger, calling her a useless burden, and effectively casting her aside. His response felt like a slap in the face, one that crushed the last of her hopes that her sacrifices would be met with the gratitude and love she had given to him. Ethan had grown up, and instead of appreciating all that Margaret had done, he saw her as nothing more than a financial resource, someone to be used when convenient. In that moment, Margaret realized something important. Her life could no longer revolve around Ethan's needs, and it was time for her to start living for herself. The realization hit her hard, but it also sparked a shift in Margaret's thinking. She had been a mother who had selflessly devoted herself to raising Ethan, and she had always put his needs before hers. However, Ethan's behavior showed her that this kind of sacrifice was not only unappreciated, but it had also eroded her own sense of self-worth. Margaret knew she could no longer continue sacrificing herself for someone who did not value her. That was when she made the bold decision to retire and live for herself, to stop enabling Ethan's entitlement, and to finally put her own happiness and well-being first. What Margaret didn't realize at the time was that her late employer, Catherine, who had treated her with kindness and respect, had left her a significant inheritance, $8 million. This unexpected windfall became the turning point in Margaret's life, as it gave her the financial freedom to finally break free from the cycle of dependency and manipulation she had experienced with Ethan. Catherine had been like family to Margaret, and her generosity meant that Margaret no longer had to work for the sake of survival. She could now live independently and on her own terms. However, despite the money, Margaret's decision was not driven by a desire for revenge or material gain. It was about regaining her dignity, her sense of self, and her right to live her own life. Margaret's new financial independence also revealed the true nature of Ethan and his wife, Nicole. Instead of appreciating the peace Margaret was seeking, they saw her as a source of income and tried to manipulate her into continuing to work for them. Nicole, in particular, dismissed Margaret's offer to help with the pregnancy and recovery, instead suggesting Margaret return to work as a live-in assistant for a wealthy man. To them, Margaret's only value was in her ability to work and contribute financially, rather than the love and care she had shown them over the years. This cruelty, especially coming from people she had helped so much, was the final straw for Margaret. In the face of this betrayal, Margaret decided to sever ties with Ethan and Nicole. She made it clear that she would no longer allow herself to be mistreated, no longer allow herself to be exploited. Margaret's decision to reclaim her life and stop enabling their toxic behavior was a powerful moment of personal empowerment. As she moved out of the home she had once worked so hard to provide for them, Margaret was faced with the daunting task of figuring out what came next, but she knew it was time to take control of her own destiny. Margaret's transformation was not just about financial freedom, but about emotional liberation as well. She learned that self-care was not selfish, and that setting boundaries was necessary for her own survival. She moved into a new home, one that was hers entirely, free from the toxic weight of Ethan and Nicole's demands. As she settled into her new life, Margaret began to rediscover herself. She indulged in hobbies, made new connections, and focused on living for her own happiness. The relief of no longer carrying the burden of guilt or expectations was palpable, and Margaret began to experience a sense of peace that had eluded her for so many years. The emotional toll that Margaret had endured over the years was finally being replaced with a sense of pride and self-respect. It wasn't just about the inheritance or the new home or even the peace she now had. It was about Margaret finally standing up for herself and taking control of her life. Her journey was one of learning that love should never come at the expense of self-destruction. Margaret's story reminds us all that we are worthy of respect, love, and care, not just from others, but from ourselves as well. When we stop sacrificing our own well-being for others, we create the space to truly live for ourselves. Margaret's story is a powerful lesson in self-care, empowerment, and the importance of setting boundaries, no matter how difficult it may seem at first. Margaret's journey is one of immense sacrifice, personal transformation, and eventual empowerment. For over 30 years, she devoted her life to raising Ethan, the son she adopted as a baby. Ethan, born with a severe congenital heart defect and abandoned by his birth parents, found his way into Margaret's heart when she volunteered at a local orphanage. Margaret knew that raising him would come with challenges, especially as a single mother, but she didn't hesitate to pour all her energy into giving him the best life possible. She worked tirelessly, taking on multiple jobs and even sacrificing her own dreams and comfort to ensure Ethan would have a chance at a better future. Her dedication to Ethan was unwavering, even as she gave up her marriage and personal life to prioritize his needs. However, despite her years of devotion, the love and respect she had hoped to receive in return from Ethan and his family never materialized. The turning point came when Margaret lost her job. She had hoped that, after all her sacrifices, her son would show understanding and offer support, but instead, Ethan responded with anger and disdain, calling her a burden and throwing her out of his life. This cruel reaction shattered Margaret's heart, but it also triggered a profound change in her. For the first time, Margaret realized that her life could no longer be about serving others at the cost of her own happiness and well-being. Ethan's words cut deeply, but they also gave her the clarity she needed to make an important decision. It was time to stop living for Ethan and start living for herself. Margaret's journey to self-discovery and independence took an unexpected turn when she learned that her late employer, Catherine, had left her a substantial inheritance of $8 million. Catherine had treated Margaret like family, and her generous bequest became the catalyst for Margaret's newfound sense of freedom. Margaret could now afford to live on her own terms, without the burden of financial dependence on anyone. The inheritance, however, was not the driving force behind her decision to change her life. It was the realization that she had spent too many years being used and unappreciated. Margaret had spent decades sacrificing her time, energy, and resources for the happiness and well-being of Ethan and his family, but in return, she had been treated as nothing more than a financial resource. No amount of love or sacrifice seemed to be enough for Ethan, and that realization was devastating. Instead of seeking revenge or returning to the same toxic cycle, Margaret made the bold choice to retire and stop enabling Ethan's sense of entitlement. She realized that her worth was not tied to her ability to work and support others. With her newfound wealth, she could finally take control of her life and start living for herself. However, Margaret's decision to step away from Ethan and his demands was not met with understanding from him or his wife, Nicole. They were both more concerned with their own financial security than with Margaret's well-being. Nicole, in particular, dismissed Margaret's offer to help with the pregnancy, instead suggesting that Margaret return to working as a live-in assistant for a wealthy man. This cruel suggestion was the final straw for Margaret, and she realized that the family she had spent so much time and energy supporting had no intention of valuing her for who she was. Margaret's decision to break free from Ethan and Nicole was both empowering and painful. She left behind the home she had worked so hard to provide for them and moved into a new, independent life. The emotional toll of years of sacrifice, manipulation, and disrespect was immense, but Margaret knew it was the right choice for her. She learned that love should never come at the cost of self-destruction, and that self-care was not selfish, it was necessary for her own survival. Margaret's journey was not just about financial freedom, but about emotional liberation. She had spent too long living for others, and now it was time for her to live for herself. As Margaret moved into her new life, she began to rediscover her passions and interests. She enrolled in a community college to explore new hobbies and connect with like-minded individuals. For the first time in years, Margaret felt like she was living for herself, free from the weight of others' expectations. The emotional freedom that came with breaking ties with Ethan and his family was profound, and Margaret began to experience a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She no longer had to be anyone's caretaker or financial support. She could finally take a breath and focus on her own happiness and well-being. Margaret's transformation was not without its challenges. Ethan's manipulative behavior and his attempts to manipulate public opinion through social media were a reminder of the pain he had caused her. However, Margaret faced these challenges head-on, using her newfound independence and strength to confront him. Her ability to stand up for herself and refuse to be a victim was a powerful moment in her journey, and it was the moment when she truly began to reclaim her life. Margaret learned that sometimes, in order to move forward, we must let go of the toxic relationships that hold us back. For Margaret, that meant walking away from Ethan, from the man she had devoted her life to, and from the family that had never appreciated her. In the end, Margaret realized that her true family was not defined by blood or marriage, it was defined by the people who loved and respected her for who she was, and the life she had built for herself. Margaret's story is a powerful reminder that self-sacrifice should never come at the cost of self-respect. It is never too late to reclaim your life, live for yourself, and let go of the toxic people who drain your energy. Margaret's journey to self-love and independence serves as an inspiration to anyone who has ever felt unappreciated or taken for granted, showing that it is possible to rebuild your life and find happiness on your own terms. Margaret's journey is one of profound transformation, filled with pain, resilience, and self-discovery. For over 30 years, she dedicated her life to raising Ethan, her adopted son, whom she rescued from the despair of abandonment. Ethan was just a baby when Margaret first encountered him at a local orphanage, frail and with a severe congenital heart defect. It was a moment that would change her life forever. Margaret, despite her own financial struggles and the breakdown of her marriage, chose to adopt him, giving up her personal life and dreams to raise him. Over the years, she worked multiple jobs, often sacrificing her own health and happiness to ensure Ethan had everything he needed. Her love for him was boundless, and she poured everything she had into making sure he succeeded, all the while hoping he would grow to appreciate the sacrifices she made for him. However, as Margaret entered her late 50s, things began to shift. After years of hard work and dedication, Margaret found herself at a crossroads when she lost her job. Instead of offering support, her son, Ethan, responded with cruel indifference. Rather than showing gratitude for the years of sacrifice Margaret had given, he called her a burden, accusing her of freeloading. His harsh words stung deeply, but they also marked a turning point for Margaret. For the first time in her life, she realized that she had allowed herself to be used for so long that she had lost her sense of identity. Ethan's callousness shattered her illusion of the close, loving relationship she had hoped they shared. That was the moment Margaret made a decision that would change the course of her life. It was time to stop living for others and start living for herself. Margaret's journey toward independence began when she discovered that her late employer, Catherine, had left her an $8 million inheritance. Catherine had been more than just an employer. She had been a friend, treating Margaret with the kindness and respect that had been so sorely lacking from her own family. This inheritance was not just a financial windfall for Margaret, it was a symbol of the respect and appreciation she had long been denied. It gave her the freedom to finally break away from the toxic relationship with Ethan and his wife, Nicole. Margaret's newfound wealth allowed her to step away from the oppressive demands of her son and his family and to pursue a life of her own choosing, free from the emotional manipulation and financial exploitation she had endured. Despite the overwhelming urge to settle scores, Margaret didn't retaliate with anger or revenge. Instead, she made a bold and empowering decision. She retired from working and reclaimed her life. When she attempted to offer help to Nicole during her pregnancy, Margaret was met with scorn and condescension. Nicole, whose family had always looked down on Margaret, belittled her and dismissed her offer to help, instead suggesting that Margaret work as a live-in assistant to a wealthy man. That was the final straw. Margaret realized that her family didn't see her as a person with her own needs and desires. To them, she was nothing more than a provider, a means to an end. Margaret's choice to retire and step away from Ethan's demands was not easy. It was an act of self-preservation and self-love, but it also marked the end of an era of constant self-sacrifice. She had spent so many years pouring her energy into supporting Ethan and his family, only to be treated as disposable. The pain of this realization was immense, but it was also liberating. Margaret's decision to let go of the role of the caretaker allowed her to begin living for herself. No longer bound by the chains of guilt and expectation, she started to explore new passions and interests. Margaret enrolled in a community college, reconnected with her hobbies, and began building a life that was centered around her own happiness. As Margaret embraced her new life, she encountered challenges, particularly from Ethan, who was unwilling to let go of his sense of entitlement. When he found out about the inheritance, he tried to manipulate the situation by slandering Margaret online, painting her as a cold, heartless mother who had abandoned him. Despite the cruel campaign against her, Margaret stood strong, refusing to let her son's actions dictate her sense of self-worth. She took control of the narrative, confronting Ethan's lies head-on and revealing the truth of her sacrifices. Through her own live stream, Margaret exposed the manipulation and exploitation she had endured, sharing her side of the story with the world. This act of defiance not only cleared her name, but also helped Margaret reclaim her dignity. Ethan's manipulation backfired when public opinion shifted in Margaret's favor. The more he tried to play the victim, the more his actions became clear to everyone around him. His attempts to use social media to gain sympathy only served to highlight his selfishness and lack of gratitude. Meanwhile, Margaret's strength and courage inspired others. Her decision to walk away from a toxic relationship, even one with her own son, became a symbol of empowerment. She had learned the invaluable lesson that self-sacrifice should never come at the expense of self-respect, and that it was never too late to start living for oneself. In the end, Margaret's story is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your life. Her journey of emotional and financial independence shows that even in the face of betrayal and adversity, it's possible to stand up for yourself and create the life you deserve. Margaret's story serves as an inspiration for anyone who has ever been taken for granted or made to feel invisible, proving that true happiness begins when you stop living for others and start living for yourself. Margaret's story is a raw, emotional journey of self-discovery, sacrifice, and empowerment. For decades, she devoted her life to her adopted son, Ethan, and gave up everything to raise him. From the moment Margaret found Ethan as a vulnerable infant in a local orphanage, she chose to love him as her own, despite the harshness of her circumstances. She worked multiple jobs, gave up her personal dreams, and sacrificed her health to provide for Ethan, and ensure that he had every opportunity for a better life. Even through the dissolution of her own marriage, Margaret never faltered in her commitment to Ethan, often putting him first over her own well-being. Her efforts were not just out of obligation, but stemmed from deep, unconditional love, and her sacrifices were made without expecting anything in return. Ethan's life was carefully crafted by Margaret's hands, from his medical care to his education, all supported by her tireless labor. But when Margaret lost her job at the age of 58, the son she had poured her life into showed her a cruel and callous side that shook her to her core. Instead of offering support, Ethan, now married to Nicole, responded by calling her a burden and telling her to leave his home. He accused her of freeloading, making it painfully clear that all her sacrifices had been taken for granted. This heart-wrenching moment was the catalyst that forced Margaret to finally stand up for herself. For the first time in her life, Margaret saw Ethan not as the son she had devoted herself to, but as someone who saw her only as a tool for his financial gain. The raw pain of his words broke her heart, but it also opened her eyes to a painful truth. She had allowed herself to be used, and it was time to stop. What Margaret didn't know at the time was that her late employer, Catherine, whom she had worked for with unwavering loyalty and devotion, had left her an inheritance, $8 million. This inheritance was more than just money. It represented years of Margaret's hard work and commitment, and it marked the beginning of her own journey to independence. Catherine had always treated Margaret with respect and kindness, unlike her own family, and this inheritance was a testament to that. Margaret chose not to share this news with Ethan immediately. Instead, she focused on reclaiming her own life and dignity. She began to see herself not just as a mother, but as a woman who deserved happiness and peace, free from the emotional manipulation and financial exploitation of those who had used her. The final straw came when Margaret, after quitting her job, offered to help her daughter-in-law, Nicole, with her pregnancy. Instead of gratitude, she was met with disdain and condescension. Nicole, along with her mother Susan, looked down on Margaret, belittling her ability to care for a newborn, despite Margaret's years of experience and sacrifice. They dismissed her with a callous suggestion: she should work as a live-in assistant for a wealthy man. Margaret's decision to retire and leave the toxic household was not just about her desire for rest, it was about reclaiming her autonomy, which had been stripped away over the years. She had sacrificed so much for Ethan and his family, and now it was time for her to live for herself, for the first time in decades. Margaret's path to reclaiming her life wasn't without struggle. Ethan, unable to accept that his mother would no longer finance his lifestyle, tried to manipulate and guilt her into returning to her previous role as the family's financial provider. But Margaret was resolute. She had spent years being the backbone of her family, and now, for the first time, she stood up for herself, refusing to let anyone control her happiness. Her decision was a painful but necessary one. She stopped supporting Ethan financially and emotionally, and she began to carve out a new life. Margaret's inheritance gave her the freedom to explore new opportunities. She enrolled in a community college, rekindled her love for painting, and took up new hobbies. For the first time, Margaret was living for herself and not for anyone else. The emotional journey Margaret went through was not just about financial independence, it was about emotional liberation. As her story unfolded, Margaret became aware of how deeply ingrained guilt and duty had shaped her actions for years. She had placed everyone else's needs above her own, never allowing herself to take a break or to prioritize her happiness. When she shared her story publicly, the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life empathized with her pain and applauded her courage in breaking free from the emotional chains that bound her. Margaret's strength and self-realization became an inspiration to many who had felt trapped in unhealthy relationships with their own families. Her decision to walk away from Ethan was not easy, but it was empowering. Margaret learned that love should not come at the expense of self-respect. She had spent her life giving without expecting anything in return, but in the process, she had lost herself. It wasn't until she chose to stop sacrificing for others that she was able to rediscover who she truly was. The financial security that Catherine's inheritance provided allowed Margaret to finally live without fear or regret. For the first time in years, she felt free. Margaret's story is one of hope, strength, and the power of self-realization. It serves as a powerful reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your life and live for yourself, no matter how much you've given to others. Margaret's story is one of heartbreaking betrayal, sacrifice, and ultimate liberation. For decades, she devoted herself entirely to raising her adopted son, Ethan, giving up her own dreams, health, and personal happiness to ensure that he had every chance at a better life. She worked tirelessly, often juggling multiple jobs, to cover his medical expenses, provide him with a stable home, and even pay for his education. Through it all, she sacrificed everything: her marriage, her time, and her own needs, believing that her love and devotion would eventually be appreciated by Ethan and his wife, Nicole. But the moment Margaret lost her job and shared the news with Ethan, the reality of their relationship came crashing down. Instead of offering support or understanding, Ethan's response was cold and cruel. He accused her of being a burden and a parasite, demanding that she leave his home. His words hit her like a slap to the face, cutting deeper than anything she had ever experienced. This moment of emotional devastation was the turning point for Margaret. For the first time, she saw Ethan not as the son she had devoted her life to, but as someone who only saw her as a tool for financial gain. It was a painful realization, but it also marked the beginning of her journey toward reclaiming her life. Margaret had given everything for Ethan, but it became clear that he had taken her sacrifices for granted. He and Nicole had used her for their own benefit, expecting her to continue working and supporting their household without a second thought for her well-being. Margaret's decision to stand up for herself was not easy, but it was necessary. What Margaret didn't know at the time was that her late employer, Catherine, had left her a substantial inheritance, a fortune worth over $8 million. This inheritance wasn't just about money. It represented years of hard work and loyalty that Catherine had recognized and valued. It was a blessing that Margaret never expected, but it gave her the freedom she desperately needed to break away from the toxic environment that Ethan and Nicole had created. She chose not to tell Ethan about the inheritance immediately. Instead, Margaret focused on finding the strength to reclaim her own life. She realized that she had spent too many years giving to others and neglecting her own needs. It was time for her to prioritize herself. When Margaret shared her decision to retire and leave her job, her offer to help Nicole during her pregnancy was met with disdain. Nicole and her mother, Susan, belittled Margaret, dismissing her ability to care for a newborn. They suggested that Margaret should go back to working as a live-in assistant for a wealthy elderly man, something they believed would be more in line with her usefulness. This was the final straw for Margaret. After all the years of sacrifice, she was still being treated like an outsider, and her value was reduced to nothing more than her ability to work and earn money for others. It was at this point that Margaret fully realized the depth of the emotional manipulation she had been subjected to for so long. Ethan and Nicole had never seen her as a mother. They saw her as a source of income. The sacrifices Margaret had made for them were never appreciated. Instead, they took everything she gave them for granted. Margaret's decision to leave wasn't just about quitting her job. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her self-respect, and her right to live her life on her own terms. She had spent years putting Ethan and his family first, but now it was her turn. Margaret's journey of self-liberation wasn't without obstacles. Ethan, unable to accept his mother's newfound independence, tried to guilt her into coming back and providing for him once again. But Margaret remained firm in her decision. She stopped being the person who always put everyone else's needs above her own. She chose to live for herself, and in doing so, she discovered a new sense of purpose and peace. The inheritance she received gave her the financial freedom to pursue her passions and explore new opportunities. Margaret enrolled in community college, started painting again, and took time for herself, things she had neglected for far too long. Her story is one of empowerment, showing that it's never too late to reclaim your life and prioritize your own happiness. Margaret's strength in the face of betrayal is a testament to the power of self-discovery and the importance of standing up for yourself, no matter how difficult it may be. By walking away from Ethan and Nicole, Margaret learned that love should never come at the cost of self-destruction. She had given everything for them, but in the end, she realized that it was time to give back to herself. Margaret's journey is a powerful reminder that sometimes The hardest and most important thing you can do is let go of toxic relationships and start living for yourself. It's a message of hope for anyone who feels trapped by the expectations and demands of others. Margaret's story proves that it's never too late to live your truth and embrace your own happiness. Margaret's story is one of immense sacrifice, painful realization, and ultimately a powerful reclaiming of her life. For over 30 years, she poured her heart and soul into raising Ethan, her adopted son. She worked multiple jobs, scraped together every penny, and gave up her own personal happiness to ensure that he had the best life possible. Margaret's devotion to Ethan was unwavering, and she sacrificed her own needs, dreams, and health, believing that one day he would appreciate her efforts. However, that moment of appreciation never came. When she lost her job, her son's first response was to turn on her, calling her a useless burden and a parasite. This hurtful reaction from the person she had spent her entire life caring for was a turning point for Margaret. It was the moment she realized that, despite all her sacrifices, Ethan no longer saw her as a mother, but as a tool for his financial gain. For the first time in her life, Margaret decided to stop swallowing her pride. She knew it was time to take control of her own future, to stop being the mother who was stepped on, and to stand up for herself. What Margaret didn't realize at first was that she had a powerful ally in the form of a substantial inheritance from her late employer, Catherine, who had recognized her years of hard work and dedication. This inheritance, worth over $8 million, gave Margaret the financial freedom she had never had before. Catherine had always treated Margaret like family, and now, in her passing, Margaret was the sole beneficiary of a fortune that would give her the opportunity to start fresh and live for herself. Despite the immense betrayal she felt from Ethan and his wife, Nicole, Margaret held off on revealing the inheritance. She chose to keep the money a secret for now, focusing on finding the strength to reclaim her own life. It was time to stop being the person who gave everything to others without receiving anything in return. When Margaret returned home to find that Ethan and Nicole had no intention of treating her with the respect she deserved, she knew that her decision to leave and retire was the right one. Nicole and her mother, Susan, belittled her, questioning her ability to care for her future grandchildren and dismissing her as an unqualified housekeeper. They suggested that Margaret go back to work for a wealthy elderly man, offering her services as a live-in assistant. This suggestion was the final straw. After everything Margaret had done for them, all the years she had spent supporting their lifestyle, they still saw her as nothing more than a tool for financial gain. It was then that Margaret realized she had been trapped in a relationship of emotional manipulation and control for far too long. The final blow came when Margaret stood firm in her decision to retire. She announced that she would no longer work for anyone, that her days of being exploited were over. Ethan, who had always relied on her financial support, was furious. He demanded that she continue working, as their expenses were about to double with the arrival of a child. He saw her as a means to an end, a way to continue living a comfortable life without having to put in the work himself. Margaret's heart broke, but she knew it was time to walk away. She had given him everything, and now she needed to give herself the life she deserved. Margaret's journey to self-empowerment wasn't easy. Ethan's cruelty and the emotional manipulation from Nicole and Susan weighed heavily on her. But Margaret found strength in the inheritance she had received, as well as in her own resolve to live her life on her terms. She took the first steps toward independence, enrolling in community college, exploring her love of painting, and taking time to enjoy the small things in life. For the first time in decades, she felt free. She no longer felt the weight of others' expectations crushing her every move. When Margaret's inheritance came to light, Ethan and Nicole were stunned. They had no idea that she had been financially secure all along. The moment Margaret walked into a luxury real estate office and made a large purchase without hesitation, she realized that she had finally regained control of her life. Her strength in the face of betrayal was unwavering, and she was ready to take on the world for herself. As her story spread, Margaret became an inspiration to others who had been taken for granted, reminding them that it is never too late to prioritize oneself and reclaim their own happiness. Margaret's decision to cut ties with Ethan wasn't about abandoning him. It was about finally understanding that love should never come at the cost of self-destruction. She had spent too many years giving everything she had for others, only to be left with nothing but heartache. By walking away, Margaret learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to let go. She had given her all, and now it was time to live for herself. The strength she showed in taking control of her own destiny is a testament to the power of self-love, self-respect, and the courage to stand up for one's own happiness. Margaret's story proves that it's never too late to reclaim your life and live for yourself. Margaret's story is a testament to the sacrifices of motherhood, the deep emotional toll of ungratefulness, and the powerful journey of self-discovery and empowerment that follows. For 30 years, she dedicated herself to her adopted son, Ethan. From working multiple jobs to scraping together every penny. She gave up her own dreams, health, and happiness, believing that one day her sacrifices would be appreciated. It was the moment she realized that, despite all her sacrifices, Ethan no longer saw her as a mother, but as a tool for his financial gain. For the first time in her life, Margaret decided to stop swallowing her pride. She knew it was time to take control of her own future, to stop being the mother who was stepped on, and to stand up for herself. What Margaret didn't realize at first was that she had a powerful ally in the form of a substantial inheritance from her late employer, Catherine, who had recognized her years of hard work and dedication. This inheritance, worth over $8 million, gave Margaret the financial freedom she had never had before. Catherine had always treated Margaret like family, and now, in her passing, Margaret was the sole beneficiary of a fortune that would give her the opportunity to start fresh and live for herself. Despite the immense betrayal she felt from Ethan and his wife, Nicole, Margaret held off on revealing the inheritance. She chose to keep the money a secret for now, focusing on finding the strength to reclaim her own life. It was time to stop being the person who gave everything to others without receiving anything in return. When Margaret returned home to find that Ethan and Nicole had no intention of treating her with the respect she deserved, she knew that her decision to leave and retire was the right one. Nicole and her mother, Susan, belittled her, questioning her ability to care for her future grandchildren and dismissing her as an unqualified housekeeper. They suggested that Margaret go back to work for a wealthy elderly man, offering her services as a live-in assistant. This suggestion was the final straw. After everything Margaret had done for them, all the years she had spent supporting their lifestyle, they still saw her as nothing more than a tool for financial gain. It was then that Margaret realized she had been trapped in a relationship of emotional manipulation and control for far too long. The final blow came when Margaret stood firm in her decision to retire. She announced that she would no longer work for anyone, that her days of being exploited were over. Ethan, who had always relied on her financial support, was furious. He demanded that she continue working, as their expenses were about to double with the arrival of a child. He saw her as a means to an end, a way to continue living a comfortable life without having to put in the work himself. Margaret's heart broke, but she knew it was time to walk away. She had given him everything, and now she needed to give herself the life she deserved. Margaret's journey to self-empowerment wasn't easy. Ethan's cruelty and the emotional manipulation from Nicole and Susan weighed heavily on her. But Margaret found strength in the inheritance she had received, as well as in her own resolve to live her life on her terms. She took the first steps toward independence, enrolling in community college, exploring her love of painting, and taking time to enjoy the small things in life. For the first time in decades, she felt free. She no longer felt the weight of others' expectations crushing her every move. When Margaret's inheritance came to light, Ethan and Nicole were stunned. They had no idea that she had been financially secure all along. The moment Margaret walked into a luxury real estate office and made a large purchase without hesitation, she realized that she had finally regained control of her life. Her strength in the face of betrayal was unwavering, and she was ready to take on the world for herself. As her story spread, Margaret became an inspiration to others who had been taken for granted, reminding them that it is never too late to prioritize oneself and reclaim their own happiness. Margaret's decision to cut ties with Ethan wasn't about abandoning him. It was about finally understanding that love should never come at the cost of self-destruction. She had spent too many years giving everything she had for others, only to be left with nothing but heartache. By walking away, Margaret learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to let go. She had given her all, and now it was time to live for herself. The strength she showed in taking control of her own destiny is a testament to the power of self-love, self-respect, and the courage to stand up for one's own happiness. Margaret's story proves that it's never too late to reclaim your life and live for yourself. Margaret's story is a testament to the sacrifices of motherhood, the deep emotional toll of ungratefulness, and the powerful journey of self-discovery and empowerment that follows. For 30 years, she dedicated herself to her adopted son, Ethan. From working multiple jobs to scraping together every penny. She gave up her own dreams, health, and happiness, believing that one day her sacrifices would be appreciated. Despite everything she did for him, nurturing him through illness, paying for his education, and even buying a home for his family, Ethan's first reaction when she lost her job was to throw her out of the house, calling her a useless burden. It was in this moment, the moment of betrayal and pain, that Margaret made a life-changing decision. She could no longer tolerate being taken for granted or being treated as a financial tool for her son. The years of her selflessness had finally led her to realize that she had to stand up for herself, for her own peace, and for her own happiness. Margaret's heartache wasn't simply rooted in Ethan's actions. It was also in the painful realization that, after all the years she spent caring for him, he had turned into someone who only valued her for what she could provide financially. Her world crumbled when she realized that the people she sacrificed everything for, including her marriage and personal well-being, didn't see her as a mother, but as a commodity. This overwhelming feeling of disrespect from the people she had trusted the most was compounded by the attitude of her daughter-in-law, Nicole, and her mother-in-law, Susan. Their dismissive attitude toward her, especially when it came to her offering to help with the pregnancy, made Margaret feel invisible and worthless. They mocked her efforts, even suggesting she go work for a wealthy old man just to earn money. This was the breaking point for Margaret. No longer willing to sacrifice herself for a family that saw her as expendable, she decided to retire and take control of her life. What Margaret hadn't shared with anyone, not even Ethan, was the fact that she had received a substantial inheritance from her late employer, Catherine, who had recognized her years of devotion. Catherine had treated Margaret like family and had left her a fortune worth $8 million. This inheritance gave Margaret the financial independence she had never known. However, instead of reveling in her newfound freedom, she chose to keep the money a secret, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. When the emotional toll of living under Ethan's roof, constantly serving his demands, became unbearable, Margaret realized that it was time to make a change. It wasn't about the money, but about reclaiming her life and her dignity. When Margaret returned home to confront Ethan and Nicole about their treatment of her, the reactions were predictable. Ethan's anger flared as he accused her of being irresponsible for quitting her job, while Nicole and Susan continued to belittle her, making it clear that they didn't see her as an equal. They had grown accustomed to her financial support, and their disregard for her well-being became more apparent with every word they spoke. It was then that Margaret made the bold decision to walk away. She wouldn't be manipulated any longer. She didn't owe them anything, and she refused to live in a house where she was treated like a burden. The moment Margaret stepped out of Ethan's life was both painful and liberating. It was the culmination of decades of silent suffering and the beginning of a new chapter. She didn't need to ask for permission to live her life. She was taking it back. Margaret used her inheritance to buy a home for herself, a place where she could live independently and find joy in the simple pleasures she had been denied for so long. She also took the time to explore her own interests, enrolling in community college and immersing herself in new hobbies. For the first time, Margaret was free from the suffocating weight of her family's expectations. Her new life wasn't just about the material wealth she had acquired. It was about finally choosing herself over the needs of others. It was about learning that it was okay to say no, to stop sacrificing her happiness for people who didn't value her. Margaret's story is one of empowerment, self-respect, and resilience. She showed that it's never too late to reclaim your life and live on your own terms. While Ethan and his family may have expected her to remain a lifelong servant, Margaret's decision to walk away from them was the ultimate act of self-preservation. What followed was nothing short of a transformation. Margaret's newfound independence allowed her to rediscover who she truly was, apart from the roles she had been forced to play for so many years. She found joy in the little things: gardening, painting, and even playing the piano. Her strength and determination to move forward were evident when she faced the judgment of her son, who later tried to manipulate her into helping him once again. But Margaret knew better now. She had learned to set boundaries and to stand up for herself. In the end, Margaret didn't just find financial freedom, she found peace. She realized that the most important lesson she had learned in life was that kindness and love should never come at the cost of self-destruction. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that we all have the right to live for ourselves, no matter how many sacrifices we've made for others. Margaret's journey is one of strength, growth, and self-love, showing that it's never too late to start over and find the happiness you deserve. Margaret's story is one of immense sacrifice, ungratefulness, and ultimately, personal empowerment that unfolds after decades of selflessness. For 30 years, she poured her heart and soul into raising her adopted son, Ethan. She worked tirelessly at multiple jobs, from late-night sewing clothes to taking on housekeeping work, all to ensure that Ethan had the best life possible, even sacrificing her own dreams and well-being. Margaret gave up her marriage for him, choosing to leave her husband when he demanded that she send Ethan back to the orphanage, preferring a biological child over the one they had adopted. Margaret's devotion was steadfast as she worked double shifts and lived frugally to support Ethan, ensuring he received the medical care and education he needed. She saved for years to buy him a house, pouring every penny she had into providing for him. However, when she finally lost her job and was left feeling vulnerable and uncertain, Ethan's first reaction was shockingly cold. He threw her out of the house, calling her a burden and a parasite. Margaret was devastated by his words, but realized that this was the tipping point for her. The years of sacrifice and devotion had not earned her respect, only resentment, and she decided that enough was enough. It was in this moment of betrayal and emotional devastation that Margaret made the powerful choice to stand up for herself. She realized that after years of serving her family, she had forgotten to live for herself. Ethan and his wife, Nicole, had never respected her, even suggesting that she move in with a wealthy elderly man as a living assistant. They saw her as nothing more than a financial resource, and when she no longer had a job, they didn't hesitate to push her out. This harsh treatment made Margaret see the truth about her position in their lives. She had been giving endlessly, but her family viewed her only as a tool to support their own needs. The realization stung, but it was also liberating. Margaret knew it was time to stop giving, stop being the one who bent over backward for those who never appreciated her sacrifices. What Margaret hadn't shared with Ethan was that she had inherited a fortune of $8 million from her late employer, Catherine, who had treated Margaret like family. Catherine, a woman with no children of her own, left her entire estate to Margaret as a thank you for her years of hard work. Margaret didn't reveal the inheritance immediately, waiting for the right moment, but when she saw how Ethan and Nicole had treated her, she realized she didn't owe them anything. She had worked for every penny she earned, and now she had the financial independence she had always dreamed of. Margaret wasn't interested in revenge, but she was ready to take control of her life again. No longer willing to live under Ethan's roof as a servant, she decided to retire and take her life back. As Margaret walked away from her family, it was clear that she wasn't just walking out of a house, she was reclaiming her dignity and her life. She moved into a luxury home, using her inheritance, the first step in living on her own terms. For the first time, Margaret could breathe freely, and she began to rediscover herself. She enrolled in community college, rekindled hobbies she had put aside for decades, and found joy in the simple things she had neglected. This new life was hers, and for once, she wasn't living for anyone else. The realization that she didn't need to keep giving to those who had taken so much from her was empowering. Margaret's journey became a path to self-empowerment, and with it came the freedom she had longed for. However, Ethan wasn't finished with her yet. After Margaret had cut him off, he tried to manipulate her into coming back, but she remained firm. His cries, his manipulative behavior, and his use of guilt no longer affected her. Eventually, Ethan went so far as to live-stream his version of events, portraying himself as the heartbroken victim and Margaret as the villain. He spread lies about her abandonment and tried to gather sympathy, but Margaret didn't let it slide. Instead, she launched her own stream, revealing the truth of their relationship, her sacrifices, and the years she had spent supporting him. She displayed her inheritance documents and her years of hard work, showing the world that she had always been there for Ethan, not for the money, but out of love. Her story resonated with people, and the public turned on Ethan, exposing him for the ungrateful, manipulative person he had become. Margaret's story serves as a powerful lesson in self-respect, the importance of boundaries, and the need to put yourself first after years of giving everything to others. She showed the world that it's never too late to reclaim your power and your happiness. Her courage to walk away from her son and start fresh with her newfound wealth and freedom was a testament to her strength and resilience. By standing up for herself, Margaret found a peace she had long sought. No longer weighed down by the expectations and manipulations of her family, she was finally free to live for herself. Her story serves as an inspiration to others who may feel trapped by their relationships, urging them to take control of their lives and find the courage to live on their own terms. Margaret's journey is a profound testament to resilience, self-sacrifice, and the realization that true freedom comes from standing up for oneself. For over 30 years, Margaret dedicated her life to raising Ethan, her adopted son, with unwavering devotion. She gave up everything: her marriage, her own desires, and countless hours of sleep and comfort just to give him a better life. From working long hours, picking up extra jobs, and scrimping and saving, Margaret's entire existence revolved around Ethan's well-being. She worked late nights sewing clothes, took on housekeeping jobs, and even made enormous personal sacrifices, such as forgoing her own retirement plan in order to pay off debts and keep their home. Despite the hardships, she persevered, pouring all her love and care into Ethan, always ensuring that he never went without. However, when Margaret's job was unexpectedly taken away and she was left vulnerable, Ethan's response was cruel and shocking. Rather than showing any concern or empathy for his mother's situation, he called her a burden and a parasite, demanding that she leave the house they had shared. This cruel rejection forced Margaret to confront the truth. After all her sacrifices, her son saw her as nothing more than a financial resource. In that painful moment, Margaret's world changed. She realized that for years, she had been giving without ever receiving the respect or gratitude she deserved. The people she had poured herself into, her son, his wife Nicole, and their family, had taken her love for granted. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. It was time to stop living for others and to start living for herself. With newfound clarity and determination, Margaret made a powerful decision. She chose to stop giving to those who didn't appreciate her and to stop sacrificing her own happiness for their comfort. This choice was liberating. It was the first step toward reclaiming her life and her dignity. What Margaret had not shared with Ethan was that, through her years of hard work and dedication, she had inherited a considerable fortune from her former employer, Catherine, a woman who had treated her like family and had no children of her own. Catherine left Margaret a substantial inheritance, and it was this inheritance that gave Margaret the financial freedom to start over. Rather than revealing this newfound wealth to Ethan immediately, Margaret chose to live quietly, without the need for anyone's approval. But as her son and his wife continued to disregard her, Margaret realized she no longer had anything to prove. It was her time to rest, retire, and enjoy the fruits of her labor. The moment Margaret decided to retire from work, her family's response was swift and cruel. Rather than supporting her decision to retire, they demanded that she continue working to sustain their lifestyle. Ethan's insistence that she return to work at the age of 58, despite having already sacrificed so much, was the final straw. Margaret was being treated like a machine, expected to work endlessly for their comfort and convenience. It was in this moment of clarity that Margaret realized she had given everything to her son and had nothing left to give. She had spent her entire life meeting the needs of others, and it was now time to prioritize herself. With her decision made, Margaret moved forward with her life. She sold the house she had worked so hard to provide for her family, and she used her inheritance to purchase a new, luxurious home, something that had always been a dream for herself. No longer tied to the past, Margaret found peace in her new home, free from the weight of years of unappreciated sacrifice. But just as she began to settle into her new life, Ethan's manipulative behavior escalated. He began live streaming, painting her as the villain in a sob story for his followers, casting her as the cold-hearted mother who had abandoned him for a wealthier life. He used his social media platform to gain sympathy and donations, trying to guilt her into returning to him. Instead of remaining silent, Margaret responded with her own live stream, revealing the truth about their relationship, her sacrifices, and the truth about her inheritance. She took control of the narrative, and as the comments flooded in, the public's perception of Ethan quickly turned. Margaret's bravery to stand up for herself, to expose the truth, and to reject his attempts at manipulation became an inspiration. Margaret's story is not just about betrayal and loss, it is about finding the strength to stand up for yourself, to let go of toxic relationships, and to reclaim your life after years of self-sacrifice. She learned that true love isn't about endless giving without recognition, it's about mutual respect and appreciation. By choosing to walk away from the people who took advantage of her, Margaret found her freedom. Her journey is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to start living for yourself, and that the love we give should always be returned with respect. Margaret's life may have been defined by sacrifice, but it was ultimately defined by her courage to stand up for herself, to let go of the past, and to live the life she deserved. Through this, she discovered that sometimes walking away from those who don't appreciate you is the best thing you can do for yourself. Margaret's story teaches us that self-sacrifice, while noble, should never come at the expense of our own dignity and well-being. It reminds us that love and care should be reciprocal, not one-sided. For years, Margaret gave everything to her son and family, only to be treated as an expendable resource when she needed support. The lesson here is that it's never too late to prioritize ourselves and take back control of our lives. It's important to recognize when relationships become toxic, and when our efforts are not valued, it's okay to step away for the sake of our own peace and happiness. True fulfillment comes from within, not from constantly trying to meet the needs of others at the cost of our own health and happiness. For seniors, this message is especially vital. You've given so much over the years, but it's equally important to honor your own needs, dreams, and desires. In doing so, you can experience a renewed sense of joy and purpose, free from the weight of past sacrifices. Life can still be rich with meaning and fulfillment, but only when we learn to balance giving with self-care and respect. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Stories TH for more content that inspires healing and personal growth.